All right, chapter 14 is on the brain and also a little bit on the cranial nerves. Now, in this chapter, they kind of start off with giving you a brief introduction to the brain and its different areas, and then they kind of dive a little bit deeper into each of them. To try to streamline this, I am just going to dive straight in as we start talking about the brain, and so you'll see that I'm jumping around the chapter a little bit in regards to the way that it's laid out. So here we have the brain, right? And recall when we think about the brain, if you look at the big picture, we're looking at this housing the integrating and processing centers of the brain. Recall we're getting sensory information sent to the brain, right, up the spinal cord. We have to decide what to do with that. That's this integrating and processing, and also then the initiation of those motor responses coming from the brain. We also should consider in the brain the higher order mental functions, right? So they'll talk about intelligence, memory, emotion, right? Things like that. Those higher order functions are all housed in the brain as well. So here we can see the overall outline of the brain, right? And the big portion of the brain here is called the cerebrum. And so we're just going to jump right in and talk all about the cerebrum before we continue on into these other brain regions. The detailed information about the cerebrum is found in section 14.9 in your book. So this is the brain region where we house conscious thought, sensation, intellect, memory, complex movements, right? This is a very important part of the brain. Now, the brain is separated into two cerebral hemispheres. So here we are looking at the left cerebral hemisphere, the right being on the other side, of course. And so if we turn the brain here, right, we can see our two separate hemispheres. There's a nice longitudinal fissure right down the center there. So let's first talk about the gray matter in the brain. So this picture is nice because we can actually see the cerebral cortex here, right? This kind of, again, in this picture, it's kind of tannish, but this is the gray matter. We know that gray matter means we're dealing with dendrites and cell bodies. We know that we're dealing with a lot of information processing rather than sending the information. So here the cerebral cortex, it varies between 1 and 4 millimeters in thickness. The number of neurons in the cortex then is really important to how much we can process. And so you'll see that the cortex is actually thrown into these deep folds, right? The indents are called gyri, or singularly a gyrus, and these are to increase the surface area of that cerebral cortex, right? This allows us to increase the number of cortical neurons and therefore do more information processing. Right? So we have gray matter out here in the cortex, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. Before I leave this picture, though, I do want to show you the other set of gray matter in the brain. We mentioned before the basal nuclei, and we said nuclei is the term for a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So these basal nuclei, these are masses of gray matter really deep within the brain. And the key functions here are this subconscious control of skeletal muscle tone and the coordination of learned movement patterns, right? So these are going to be places that house kind of the general pattern and rhythm, especially movements that are involved in the trunk and the proximal limbs. So like the muscles surrounding the humerus and the upper arm, or the femur in the upper leg. So like they point out in the book, when you go to write, right, that is, you need the cortex to make some conscious decisions for you, right, about what you're actually doing maybe with your hand. But subconsciously, you actually arrange your torso and the upper arm in a way that allows that, right? And so those are things that are done here in the basal nuclei. So we're going to jump back out to the cortex here. And what we can see, if we look at the surface of the brain, hopefully you will notice they've named all the lobes, and they are named for the skull bone that they are next to, right? So the frontal lobe here in pink, the parietal lobe here in purple, occipital lobe in green, and the temporal lobe here in yellow. These are all part of the cerebrum, right? And we're looking at the cortex here. A couple things to point out. So there is this central sulcus that helps divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And notice they've kind of highlighted this first gyrus, this first ridge that is anterior to that. That's called the precentral gyrus. And this houses the primary motor cortex. So this is where instructions for movement from the cerebral cortex are coming from. If you look at the postcentral gyrus, right, this is where we're going to be housing what they call the primary somatosensory cortex. This is where all the signals for things like touch, pressure, pain, vibration, temperature, right, all that sensory information that's coming in is going to land in this portion of the cerebral cortex to have a decision made about what to do with it. We can also see, as we look at this cortex, a variety of different areas. So notice here, for example, on the occipital lobe, they point out what they call the visual cortex. So this is a region on the occipital lobe where the sensory information from your eyes are coming, right? So that primary somatosensory cortex is a lot about touch, right? And then our special senses need some places to go as well. So there's your visual cortex. On the temporal lobe, we'll see that we actually have an auditory cortex, so a region of that cerebral cortex where sound is going. Where else? The gustatory cortex, right? So taste is down here on what's called the insula. So the insula is, notice they're pulling kind of the frontal and the temporal lobe apart. So deep down in there, that's the region of the brain that's going to figure out what to do with taste. And then this olfactory cortex out here also on the temporal lobe. So that's going to be where the sense of smell is going. Okay? So you have areas of the cortex that are in charge of certain information, right? Processing different things. We also have what are called association areas. So notice the visual cortex is way posterior on the occipital lobe, but the rest of the occipital lobe is highlighted as the visual association area. So these association areas are always kind of next to that cortex where the information is actually landing, but these association areas are going to help to interpret incoming data in the case of sensory, or help coordinate the motor response. So, for example, the somatosensory association cortex, it helps monitor what's coming in here on that primary somatosensory cortex, right? Help interpret the incoming data, right, for that brain region. The visual association area, right, associated with the visual cortex, just adjacent, this helps give meaning. So the visual cortex, if I wrote C, A, and T on the board, the visual cortex is seeing those letters, but it's the association area that puts them together and gives it meaning. It says, oh, cat, right? Same kind of idea here with the auditory association area. The auditory cortex is who's getting the actual information from the eardrum, right? The vibrations, but it's the association area that actually gives word recognition, right? That gives meaning to what we're hearing. Let's see, the somatic motor association. So now we're on the motor output, right? Here's your primary motor cortex. The somatic motor association area is sometimes also called the premotor cortex. This is what helps us coordinate learned movements, right? So this area is going to help relay instructions, right, to the primary motor cortex. It helps trigger that premotor cortex is going to trigger the primary motor cortex into actually sending the message, right? But it's going to help kind of figure out what we should do here. Yeah, so this is interesting. It gets more interesting. Man, people that are super into neuroanatomy always amaze me. The fact that we can do brain surgeries is always remarkable. Down here in the bottom quarter of this picture, they're pointing out a variety of different what they're calling integrative centers. And so, for example, here's that prefrontal cortex. We've talked a little bit about this in class, where this is the region that it's much more abstract, right? This prefrontal cortex has to be able to predict consequences, right? It's where your frustration lives. It's where your anxiety lives, right? These very abstract intellectual functions. Another one here, Wernicke's area. This region of the cortex houses some language comprehension, right? You can see how closely associated it is maybe with the temporal lobe and some of that auditory, but it's a little bit more than that. So language comprehension, and also they say some of your personality is basically housed here. Broca's area, this is where we get actual speech production. So notice this is on the motor kind of part of the brain. So Broca's area is going to do things like tell you where to put your tongue and your lips and how to arrange your mouth to actually produce speech. Okay, lots going on there. Oops, sorry, I had a bigger picture of that. Okay, so that's really what's going on, a very rough run through on what's going on there with the gray matter, right? The white matter that we see is actually taking up, a lot of the brain. And so let's talk briefly about what's going on here as well. Right? So we have, do I have a better, there's the one I wanted. So when we look at the white matter, what they're showing you here in all these lines are the way that different axons might be running. Okay, and so here, these big red lines, notice they're all on the same hemisphere. So these are what we would consider association fibers, right? And they're interconnecting areas of the cortex within the same hemisphere. Okay. We also have what are called commissurial fibers or commissures. The big one is the corpus callosum. You'll see that when you do brain dissections in lab, that's connecting the hemispheres. Anterior commissure is a little bit smaller, but also connecting the left and right hemisphere. And then really interesting, right, here in black, they're showing the projection fibers. So remember we talked about the thalamus, which is kind of here in the midbrain, is a big filter. And so if you think about sensory information coming up into the filter, those things that are deemed important enough, strong enough action potentials, then get kind of spread out to the correct portion of the cerebral cortex. And so those projection fibers, again, they're myelinated axons, they're white matter, but they're basically linking that midbrain or diencephalon out to the cortex. All right, so that is going to be it for the cerebrum. I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording and we'll make another one to cover these other areas of the brain.